My name is Göksel Gökçay. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Üsküdar University. Today I will talk about post-war US foreign policy toward Turkey. This is a very particular topic, of course, a very specific topic in the relations between the United States of America and Turkey. I particularly chose that topic to analyze the whole history of the United States and Turkey's relations, because understanding how the foreign policy decision-making processes are conducted, especially in the foreign countries, could help Turkey to, in a way, establish its own foreign policy decision-making processes much more carefully. So, in this presentation, I will especially focus on three themes regarding the foreign policy making of the United States in the post-war period. And when I say post-war period, I will especially focus on the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That is to say, the period between 1945 and 1953. So, first of all, I will begin especially an important topic, that is the responsibility of the region in the eyes of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the United States of America. Especially the burden of responsibility regarding the Near East or the Middle East, as it was referred later, was a particularly important topic for the hegemonic forces in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The second theme that I'm going to talk about is regarding the military strategic planning of the United States for the region, and in Turkey, and for the Turkey especially. So, in order to understand Turkey's position in the US foreign policy, we need to understand the general background of the relations between the Near East or Middle East countries. And third, but not least, I will talk about the modernization and development process in Turkey and how it was perceived and in fact was planned by the US foreign policy decision makers. But before delving on these three themes, I would like to focus on how the US foreign policy making was structured. And especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, we see a transition period, not just for the structure of the US foreign policy making, but also in terms of the administration. Since the President Roosevelt has passed away just after the end of the Second World War, Harry Truman, his vice president, took the control of the administration and began to make, of course, some minor changes with, of course, some major changes that were pushed with the events that were unfolding in the early Cold War. And in the second aspect that I want to talk about regarding the decision-making process of US foreign policy, the restructuring of the US Department of State, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the federal government in the United States, and the restructuring of the relations between the White House and the US Congress is especially important in this period. And if we look at how the decisions made with regards to the foreign policy in the United States, we see a trilateral relations between the White House, the Department of State, and the Congress. Of course, all the major decisions are made within the White House, and they are decided by the President himself or herself, or these decisions are particularly, of course, specifically designed by the bureaucrats, the people who are working for the Department of State and were, of course, advised to the President. But all the, of course, major decisions regarding the whole nation of the United States are also controlled by the US Congress, especially things like appropriations, how the federal money is spent with regards to foreign policy decisions are controlled by the Congress, and of course they are always negotiated with the White House. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, we see a restructuring of the pre-war period of the US Department of State. If we look at, especially during the war, how the Near Eastern affairs are structured, we see that countries like Turkey, Greece, and Palestine were all under the division of Near Eastern affairs, while countries like Iran were designated under the division of Middle Eastern and Iranian Indian affairs. But especially some crucial crises, some crucial points in the early Cold War began to push the decision makers of the US foreign policy to change all these structures and began to implement specific policies with regards to these three countries. Especially the crisis in Iran between the Soviet Union and the United States in terms of how to withdraw the forces of the Soviet military, and the civil war in Greece, and how this civil war could be in a way remedied with a peaceful solution, and the Soviet demands regarding the Turkey. All these crises pushed the US foreign policy makers to reorganize some divisions within the US Department of State and of course align their policies in these countries. So we see under the Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs, they established a new division called Division of Greek, Turkish and Iranian Affairs, and all these countries, these major crisis points began to be analyzed within this specially organized division. So as these crisis points, as Turkey was among one of these crisis points, began to be analyzed within the topic of burden of responsibility. Of course, before the Second World War, the region in general, the region that was that had been called as the Near East, which of course right now we call it the Middle East in general, but the area defined by the borders of Iran, Greece and Turkey was designated as the Near East, and its burden was put on the shoulders of the United Kingdom. But as the United Kingdom had a major, of course, economic problems, of course, political problems, and it was, of course, was devastated during the Second World War, the United States slowly but surely began to take the responsibility of the area from the hands of the United Kingdom. So the question was how the problems with regards to Turkey and the other countries in the Near East should be handled. So they began to discuss all these periods in different themes and different topics. First of these topics was the land and lease aid to Turkey. During the war, Turkey began to, of course, accept foreign aid from the United States of America, but with, of course, with the help of the United Kingdom. All the military aid or the civilian aid for the Turkish military were brought with the British ships and via the British control. So Turkey was quite unhappy in terms of how this aid was delivered, and Turkey was quite, of course, hesitant how to shift to the direct control of the United States and direct relations with the United States. Turkey wanted to have direct control of the delivery of these aids. So the discussions finally at the end of the Second World War was resolved, and Turkey made a mutual aid agreement on the 23rd of February in 1945 with the United States, and began to deal with the United States in terms of how to deal with the aid deliveries. And the second aspect was regarding the Soviet demands toward Turkey. At the end of the Second World War, the United Soviet Socialist Republics demanded Turkey that they should together control the straits and how they should be protected militarily. Also, the Soviets also made some demands with regards to Eastern Anatolia, and they wanted to revise the borders between the USSR and Turkey. So these demands, of course, were rejected by the government of Turkey, but United States realized that the United Kingdom's capacity was no longer powerful enough to stop the push of the Soviets and in a way to control the whole area with its, of course, military as well as economic capacity. But of course the last straw came with the civil war in Greece. The United Kingdom realized in the beginning of 1947 economically it is unable to support the war in Greece, of course, for the loyalists to the Greek government, and of course communist insurgency could not be supported anymore by the United Kingdom. So United States realized that they should slowly, without of course disturbing the United Kingdom, without intervening with their burden of responsibility, but surely, especially in the second half of 1950s, the United States began to directly negotiate with the regional countries. So in this document, in this quotation, from the concluding remarks of the meeting between the US chiefs of missions in the Near East or the Middle East region, we see that they clearly state that they don't want to bother United Kingdom in terms of infringing into their responsibility, but they also wanted to United Kingdom to realize that they are taking control of the region. So let's read the quotation, quoting, "The United States should seek an early clarification of the United States-United Kingdom military responsibilities for the Middle East. However, even though performance under such an agreement with the United Kingdom as to responsibilities be achieved through some regional arrangement, the present leading position of the United States in Turkey and Greece should be maintained." So the United States was aware of the possibility of infringing and having a clash between the United Kingdom and the US, but they also realized that they should keep their leading position in the area and of course collect the fruits of this relationship. So as the United States began to in a way implement its hegemonic force in the region, and another team came to emerge. Of course, they began to discuss how they should organize, how they should decide on the military strategic planning for the region. Of course, they were also contemplating about the possibility of a third world war. So in the case of a third world war, what role should have been assigned to Turkey? They were discussing how to implement it. Of course, some key events began to, of course, made their job much more easier, especially the British note of February 1947, of course, clarified all the dilemmas within the US government as well as within the US Congress. Because in this note, the British administration informed Turkey, Greece, and the United States that they will no longer be able to support the governments of Turkey and Greece militarily and economically. So that means that, of course, for the decision makers of the United States, that meant that the United States had to intervene. They had to, of course, take a step forward and take the responsibility of the region. And of course, excuse me, of course, the expression or the implementation of this policy came with the declaration of the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine said that the United States will intervene into the affairs of the region because this is a fight between the free countries and the countries under the threat of subjugation by evil forces. So this clear definition of being a black and white, being an evil, being a clash between the evil and good, and this depiction of these two ideological forces and the confrontation between them was also considered by many as the declaration of the Cold War per se. So the Truman Doctrine, of course, started the planning of strategic and military organization and the contingency plans for Turkey as well. And one of those plans was the Credo Plan for the Near East. And Credo Plan was the Pincher series of contingency plans. And in this plan, Turkey began to receive exclusively military aid under the Truman Doctrine. So all the aid that was provided to Turkey between 1947 and 1948 was exclusively for these military aids to prevent a possible invasion of the US forces and especially the capture of the oil fields in the Middle East. So they especially, for example, began to construct a road between Iskenderun and Erzurum, and this was a logistics road to provide the Turkish army in the event of a possible, of course, a Soviet invasion. But they also were aware of the fact that Turkish forces were not capable enough to stop and, of course, win a fight against the Soviet conventional armies. So the plan was to delay the invasion of the Soviets. While the invasion was delayed, the American B-29 bombers should bomb the Caucasus oil regions in Baku and in the surrounding areas, while the oil fields in Kirkuk and Erbil should be, of course, disabled by the Allied forces. So the role for Turkey was to, in a way, slow down the inevitable invasion of the Soviet Union under this Credo Plan. And they knew that it was much cheaper for the United States to provide the Turkish army instead of sending their own troops to the land warfare. So in the words of the General McBride, the mission chief of the military aid program in Turkey, we could clearly see that. I'm quoting from General McBride. The purpose of the aid program is to increase the combat potential of the Turkish armed forces. The present aid program would not stop the Russians, but it would help. There is enough stuff here now so that the taking of Turkey by the Soviet Union would be an expensive proposition. A lot of Russians would be killed. That is the main idea. It is cheaper for us to make use of Turkish manpower by simply supplying equipment than to bring American boys over here to fight. So the role assigned to Turkey was to provide the cheap manpower to defend the Allied forces against the invasion of oil fields in the Middle East. Of course, this would also would have meant the destruction of the whole Eastern Anatolia, and maybe the Turkish decision makers were aware of that fact. So this, in a way, preparations for the military struggle between the Soviet Union, of course, with the Western Bloc, required also economic strength. But Turkey was under a heavy burden of military spending, and the United States decision makers were, of course, aware of that fact as well. So they also began an economic integration of Turkey using foreign aid to also make it as a model for the third world as well. So the modernization program, of course, after the Truman Doctrine, after the military aid has been provided to Turkey, began with the Marshall Plan program. In fact, it was called European Recovery Plan, but it was colloquially referred as the Marshall Plan, coming from the Secretary of Department of State, George Marshall. So the Marshall Plan designated that the European countries needed an immediate support, not just for their economic development and growth, but also for just sustaining the basic requirements, basic necessities and needs of their population as well. Because especially in the winter of 1947 and 1948, we see that people were actually starving in the European countries. So they needed immediate support of, for example, basic goods like wheat or cereal production. So in this model, of course, Turkey was included with the Marshall Plan by reorganizing its economic plans, by focusing on an agricultural-led development. So within the Marshall Plan, Turkey began to provide the cereal products that Europe needed desperately. Although this quotation is a little bit long, this is giving this whole summary of the whole program of the US foreign aid in the early Cold War. So let's take a look at it. Quoting, "The basic justification for Turkish participation in the ERP continues to be the development of our economy to increase the production and export of agricultural commodities and raw materials which Western European countries must otherwise purchase against dollars. While it is realized that the approach must not be negative and that American agriculture exports to Europe will probably be stabilized at a much higher level than pre-war, it also appears that substantial increases in agricultural production within the ERP area will be necessary in order to restore a balanced economy disrupted by the war, the Iron Curtain, and the gradually changing pattern of production in Eastern Europe. With the largest unrealized potential in agricultural production of any participating country and considerable other natural resources, Turkey has an opportunity to contribute significantly toward general European viability. So let's try to dissect this quotation and understand the mechanisms of decision making in the US foreign policy. So their justification for the inclusion of Turkey was, her purpose was to provide the products that would otherwise be purchased with dollars, because the European countries lacked the dollar. It was called the dollar gap. Since those countries could not buy those products with dollars, they could buy them from Turkey by using the Marshall Plan counterpart funds, and Turkey has the greatest potential in terms of providing these agricultural products, and Turkey also with its natural resources could also sustain these countries and prevent them from, of course, shifting to the other side of the blocks, to the Eastern Bloc, or being in alignment with the Soviet Union. So Turkey's attribution, in a way, Turkey's attribution to the agricultural-led economic program was, of course, was complemented with a US-directed modernization program. All the counterpart funds that were assigned to Turkey, that was to be used for the development of Turkey, has to be approved by the US chief missions in Turkey. So all the money Turkey was receiving were actually controlled by the US decision makers. And how they have to be, of course, spent was also controlled by them. So this became also a model for the other countries as well. So as Turkey was beginning to adapt this development in a way, if we use the Rostov's analogy of stages of growth, Turkey was trying to climb these stages in the growth to become a fully industrialized country, was becoming a model for the rest of the Middle East, or maybe for the third world. But there was a problem with this system and model, because Turkey was beginning to collect commercial arrears. Turkey was unable to pay its debt to the commercial companies, because along with this Marshall Plan, along with this foreign aid program, Turkey was also requested to liberalize its trade regime. So trade liberalization, of course, brought a heavy burden of current account deficit for Turkey. So along with this current account deficit, along with the balance of payments problems for Turkey, this model, this ideal model for the US decision makers, turned out to be an insolvent one. Turkey was about to declare a default in the last years of 1950s. Between 1954 and 1956, Turkey tried to get more funding, more credit, more loans from the United States, but in all these attempts by the Menderes governments, it was rejected, because Turkey was unable to follow the stabilization programs and the requirements or the advices made by the US chief of missions. Especially in some instances, Turkey had clashes with the US decision makers. It wasn't, of course, a smooth process of agreeing with each other, implementing foreign aid programs. For example, just after the Menderes government established in the March of 1951, the Turkish government has to resign and re-established. Why? Because the three ministers of the Turkish government they signed an agreement with the US chief that they will no longer send tractors to the cotton regions. Instead, they will focus on the cereal production areas, and they will, in a way, direct the selling of those American as well as European tractors to those particular areas. And Menderes government saw this as an intervention to the country's, of course, independence. But already, before that event, the US decision makers were already intervening into the affairs and, in a way, designing the economic decision making of Turkey instead of the Turkish decision makers. So these clashes, of course, continued throughout the 1950s. And in 1958, we see that Turkey's insolvency reached such a point that Turkey had to, of course, after the elections, had to accept a stabilization program and began to receive loans from the IMF, OECD, and the United States. So after this program, about more than $350 million, and if we try to adjust it to the current values, it would make like billions of US dollars, had to be sent to Turkey, of course, gradually by implementing the stabilization program. Turkey, after that, in a way, began to stabilize in terms of its economic affairs. So, looking at these three major topics, let's try to dwell on the US foreign policy and the relations between the United States and Turkey in general. Because although this is a very specific case study, I think we can think of this as a brainstorming. We can use this case and we can try to understand the mentality of the US decision makers and can use these kinds of case studies to, of course, surmise our current strategies and current foreign policies in Turkey. And if we look at the first topic, we see that Turkey realized that there was a shift in the rise, a kind of a transition of hegemony from the British to the United States, and began to, of course, embrace the dominance of the United States in its foreign policy. But this, of course, created an imbalance. Turkey relied too much on the United States, and of course, starting with the 1960s, we began to see the clashes between the United States and Turkey, especially in terms of the Cyprus issue. Since Turkey relied too much on the US dominance in the region, since it did not follow a multilateral foreign policy making, it began to create a toll in terms of Turkey's implementation of its own foreign policies. And in the second theme, we see that Turkey's embrace of these strategic contingency plans meant that Turkey became a frontier country. Turkey became, in a way, the battleground for the upcoming, a possible Third World War, and in a way, a possible destruction of its territories, and of course, a possible annihilation of its population. So Turkey's, in a way, negligence in that sense should also be stressed for these contingency plans. And how Turkey could, in a way, could have balanced these decisions in a way in this period should be studied even further. And in the third sense, and maybe the most important one, while Turkey was focusing on its geostrategic importance, actually Turkey's economic growth, its economic development was maybe the most crucial part of this process. Since Turkey was unable to sustain a balance in terms of its payments, since it could not get rid of this current account deficit, Turkey always tried to rely on the US support in terms of paying for its own investments, in a way, sometimes even purchasing wheat from the United States in the middle of 1950s. So all these, in a way, examples could shed some light in terms of the current affairs of the Turkish government as well as its foreign policy making. Thank you for listening.